The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of lye soap and quiet desperation. Abigail Hart stood by the hearth, her chapped hands trembling as she polished a tarnished spoon. Behind her, her father's heavy boots scuffed against the floorboards. "Still here?" Shaw muttered, his voice laced with contempt. "I'd have thought some fool would have taken you off my hands by now," she didn't reply. She had learned years ago that her words were like stones dropped into a deep well. He moved across the room, stuffing clothes into a burlap sack. His, never hers. "Town meeting tonight. You'll stay put. No need to remind everyone of my burden." He turned then, his eyes raking over her as if she were spoiled goods. "You have the look of a tired old maid." "I've kept this house since Mother passed," she murmured, but the words were ash, too quiet and too late. Her existence had withered under his scorn, but she endured because no one had ever told her she was allowed to stop. Shaw snatched one of her few good shawls and tossed it into the flames. "Won't be needing that where you're headed." She stood frozen, watching the wool blacken and vanish. No tears came, only the familiar hollow ache where hope used to reside. By the time the sun bled rust and violet across the sky, Shaw had saddled his horse and ridden off. Abigail sat on the porch steps, her apron still clean, her salt and pepper hair pinned in a severe bun that had earned her so much of his derision. She did not sleep. Around midnight, the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the yard. Not one horse, but two, the second heavier, more deliberate. A tense silence fell. When the knock came, it was not hurried, just 3 solid thuds against the door. Shaw swung it open, lantern held high, and gestured toward her as if presenting a piece of livestock. "There she is. Take her." A man loomed in the doorway, a shadow so broad he seemed to strain the frame. He had a wild beard like dark moss and a pale scar that cut across his eyebrow. His clothes were of wool and leather, caked in the dust of the mountains. His name was Silas, a man of the high ridges who was often spoken of but never truly known. He said nothing, he just looked. Abigail rose, uncertain if she should protest or be grateful. "She's got sturdy hands," Shaw announced. "Good for chores. No other use to me. Barely speaks, but she's quiet." "You'll find that a blessing still." Silas remained silent. His eyes, dark as a raven's wing, stayed on her face. They were not cruel or appraising, but watchful, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. Shaw gave her a rough shove. "Go on, then. Earn your keep with him." She stepped forward, her heart a dull, painful drum. She did not weep, not even when her worn shoe caught on the threshold and she stumbled onto the frozen earth. Shaw had not told her to pack a bag. Silas turned away, leading his horse down the path without a backward glance. She followed, her thin shawl clutched tight, the hem of her dress trailing in the frosty dirt. Behind her, Shaw bolted the cabin door. There was no goodbye. They walked for what felt like hours, the moon a pale, bony disk in the sky. Each step took her further from the only life she'd known and deeper into a shapeless, silent future. At one point, Silas paused, pulling a heavy wool blanket from his thil bag. He handed it to her without a word. She accepted it as if it were a sacrament. The trail narrowed, winding into a dense forest of pine. The sounds of the night pressed in, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the gentle hush of snow beginning to dust the trees. She stumbled, and he caught her elbow, his touch firm but brief. By the time his cabin appeared, a solid structure of thick logs perched near a cliff, her knees were shaking from cold and exhaustion. Silas tethered his horse, then pushed open the door and stepped aside for her to enter. The inside smelled of pine resin and cold stone. There was one bed, a simple table, and a fire already glowing in the hearth. It was a space of pure utility, with no decorations or a woman's touch. She stood by the fire, unsure what to do with her own body. He brought in her sack, which held almost nothing, and placed it by the wall. Still no words. Abigail watched him from the corner of her eye. He moved with the unhurried deliberation of the forest itself. He poured water into a kettle and hung it over the flames. She turned toward the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. "You hungry?" he finally asked. His voice was deep, weathered by wind and long silences, but it held no malice. She could only nod. He gave her a piece of dried venison, then sat across the room, carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. They ate without speaking as snow began to tap against the roof. Later, he gestured to the bed. "Take it. I sleep by the door." She hesitated. He didn't press her, simply laying out a buffalo hide near the hearth and settling himself down like a great, still boulder. She stood in the dim light for a long while, trying to understand what this place was, or who she was meant to be now. Was she a wife, a servant, or just a stray taken in from the cold? She finally curled onto the bed and stared at the dark beams above, whispering a single, desperate prayer. "Please, let this be the end of being unwanted." By morning, a thick blanket of snow covered the clearing. She awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the rhythmic thud of an axe. Silas was outside splitting logs, his breath turning to fog in the frigid air. She turned her face from the window, a strange warmth rising in her cheeks. When he returned, he left a new pair of sturdy leather boots by the door. Not a word was exchanged, but it was the first thing anyone had given her in decades that didn't come with a price. That evening, she made a thin broth with potatoes and salt. He ate it without a word of judgment. She waited for the familiar criticism, but none came. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice rusty. "I don't talk much." He looked up from his plate. "Don't need talk to understand a person." Her throat tightened. That night, she mended a tear in her dress while he sat by the fire, his hands busy with his carving. A small, wooden bird was beginning to take shape. "You carve?" she asked. He nodded. "Sometimes." "To remember what?" He paused, his knife still. "That beautiful things can still be made." She looked down at her lap, her fingers stilling on the needle. The sentiment stayed with her long into the night. Just before she drifted off, she heard him shift on the floor, moving closer to the warmth of the fire, closer to her. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was secure and warm. And for the first time in years, she didn't dream of running away. She dreamed of staying. She dreamed of becoming something whole again, not just endured, but truly seen. And as the snow ticked against the windowpane, she realized with a strange pang that she had been placed in the hands of a man who, though silent, had never looked at her with pity, only with study, and a peculiar kind of reverence. She didn't yet understand what it meant, but it was more than Shaw had ever offered, and it would be enough to begin. The morning was painted in white silence. Snow draped the pines in soft shawls, burying the world in stillness. The wind no longer howled, it whispered, seeming to tiptoe across the clearing. Inside the cabin, Abigail moved with a newfound quiet, her new boots, stiff and warm, making only the softest creak on the floorboards. Silas had left before dawn, the door opening and closing with a quiet click that had barely disturbed her sleep. He never explained his departures, but he always returned. She stood at the hearth, stirring a pot of beans, the simple, hearty scent filling the air. She was growing to like the smell of this place, not of resentment or boiled over sorrow, but of wood smoke and the quiet industry of a man who asked for nothing. On the table lay the wooden bird he had carved, now smoothed and polished. She picked it up, running a thumb over its delicate wings. It was both simple and beautiful, crafted with a care she had long forgotten. She set it down and began to clean the floor. The realization settled in her slowly, like embers gathering heat. She wasn't doing it for him. She was cleaning because her hands needed a purpose other than to fidget with anxiety, to bring order to her own chaotic world. By noon, Silas returned, 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder, his beard dusted with white flakes. He smelled of pine and cold, clean air. "You eat?" he asked. She shook her head. "Waited for you." He nodded and set about cleaning the game. They moved around each other like 2 people learning the same melody by heart, never touching, but always aware. She realized at one point that he was humming a low, ragged tune she didn't recognize. The sound was more startling than any compliment could have been. They ate on opposite sides of the room, their chairs angled toward the fire. But when she rose to clear the plates, she saw an extra piece of cornbread on hers, slightly charred and still warm. That night, she finally unpacked her meager belongings, a tin-back brush, a locket her mother had owned, and a small square of linen embroidered with the word *Hope Star. It was faded, the threads pale, stitched by a younger hand full of dreams she no longer recognized. She sat by the fire, tracing the letters, her eyes burning. Silas glanced over but didn't pry. Instead, he said, "Storm will pass by morning. I'll take the sled to the trapline." "Might be gone a day," she nodded. "You want me to stay warm?" he added. That's all. No one had ever said that to her and meant only that. The next day passed with the slow pace of dripping molasses. She found an old wool shirt of his and patched a seam, her stitches tight and even. Her hands, which once trembled, now moved with a quiet sense of purpose. He returned that evening, weary but with a fresh-caught fish and a block of honeycomb he'd bartered for. She blinked at the golden honey. "Sweets are good in the winter," he said gruffly. "Helps keep the dark away." As days bled into weeks, a rhythm formed between them. They rarely spoke, but small kindnesses bloomed in the silence. He carved a fox and left it on her window sill. She tucked wild thyme into the stew. He left a mended glove near her coat. Each gesture was a line drawn in the sketch of something new taking shape. One evening, while sweeping, a sharp pain shot through her leg from an old injury, and she fell hard. Panic surged through her as she braced for a sharp rebuke. But Silas was kneeling beside her in an instant, not touching, just looking. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, biting her lip. "You crying?" She was, but not from the pain. "I'm fine." He helped her to a stool, then knelt and began to unlace her boot. "Don't," she started, mortified. He ignored her, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he inspected her swollen ankle. "Needs rest," he said. "I'll finish the floor," and he did, sweeping with slow, quiet strokes. That night, she wept into her pillow, not for the fall, but for the startling tenderness with which he had treated her brokenness. The next morning, he handed her a crutch he'd carved from smooth cedar. "You made this in a night?" she asked, pressing the wood to her chest. He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." Later that week, they sat outside under a sky the color of worn denim. "Did you ever think about leaving this place?" she asked softly. Silas took a long pull from his pipe. "Did too much leaving already," she nodded. "I was left," she said. "So I suppose I'm always leaving, even when I stay put." The wind blew a strand of hair across her face. Silas reached over and slowly tucked it behind her ear. His calloused fingers brushed her cheek, and she closed her eyes, savoring the warmth that lingered long after he pulled his hand away. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of hammering. On the porch stood a new rocking chair, unfinished but promising. She touched it reverently. "Are you making this for someone?" He glanced over. For the quiet she smiled, a real, soft smile. "Well, I hope it likes me sitting in it." He gave a rare, almost smile in return. "It will." That evening, as she rocked, she found the embroidered linen square on the seat, cleaned and pressed. He must have found it where she dropped it. She held it to her heart. Later, as she cleared the dinner table, Silas spoke. "You were a settler's daughter once, yes? What are you now?" She paused. "I'm still figuring that out." He nodded. Same that night, a soft snow began to fall again. She watched it from the window, her breath fogging the glass. When she turned, he was standing there, holding a thick, deep blue shawl. It wasn't new, but it was cared for. He draped it gently around her shoulders, his hands resting there a moment too long. Neither of them looked away. "You're not just warm now," he said, his voice low. "You belong." Warm. Her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in her life, warmth didn't feel borrowed. It felt given. And that changed everything. Pine needles started to emerge from the melting snow like old secrets surfacing. The dawn sky no longer grayed, it blushed with a soft, hopeful pink. The cabin seemed to sigh with the thaw, its beams stretching in the warmth. Abigail stood by a basin of water, brushing her salt and pepper hair with fingers that no longer trembled. Her reflection was faint, but she saw that the bruised look under her eyes had faded. She didn't look younger, but she no longer looked like something that had been discarded. A red dress she had stitched at night from old fabric now hung on a nail. The seams were a little crooked, but it made her feel like a person with form and substance, not just a collection of painful memories. That morning, she put it on. Silas was out back splitting logs, and when he turned and saw her, he stopped. Just for a heartbeat. In that stillness, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. He said nothing, just gave a slow, deep nod before returning to his work. She smiled to herself. Later, as they ate, at the same side of the table now, he finally spoke. "That color suits you." She looked down at her hands. "I wasn't sure it was proper." He took a slow drink of water. "It looks like truth." She didn't know exactly what that meant, but it made her feel taller. The world below hadn't forgotten her so easily. Word had trickled down to the town that Silas, the mountain hermit, had taken in Shaw's spinster daughter. The stories traveled fast, carried on whispers of shame. Abigail felt their sting when she ventured into town for salt. 2 women turned their backs as she passed. "Some people just don't know when to disappear," one of them muttered. Abigail kept walking, her shoulders straight, and thanked the clerk with a smile that didn't falter, even as heat prickled behind her eyes. When she returned, Silas was mending the chicken coop. "They called me a ghost," she said, standing beside him in the dusk. He kept hammering, slow and steady. "Is that so?" She nodded. He wiped his brow and glanced at her. "You don't look like one. What do I look like?" He paused, considering. "Someone who came back." That night, she made cornbread with molasses. He ate every crumb. After supper, as she sewed and he carved, he placed a pair of newly whittled foxes on the windowsill. "Are they together?" she asked. He looked up. "They don't need to be side by side to belong to the same forest." The hard storm rolled in the next day. As they scrambled to secure the shutters, Silas slipped on a wet stone, his shoulder hitting the wall hard. She rushed to him. "I'm fine," he grunted, but she helped him up, her grip surprisingly strong. Inside, she insisted on removing his shirt to inspect the bruise. "You have too much pride," she whispered, pressing a cold cloth to his shoulder. "And you have too much care," he whispered back. Their faces were close. "Why do you let me stay?" she asked, her voice trembling. He met her gaze. "Because you never needed my permission." Each day after that, something small shifted. He would watch her as she stirred the stew. He carved her initials, AH, into the handle of her favorite cup. One warm afternoon, she walked barefoot in the new grass, and he followed, picking a wild violet and tucking it into her hair. His fingers trembled slightly as they brushed her temple. That night, she said, "I think I'm starting to forgive myself." "For what?" he asked, poking the fire. "For believing I was what he said I was." He lied, Silas stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "I know that now," she whispered. One evening, as dusk settled like violet smoke, he asked, "You ever dance?" She blinked. Not in years. He stood and offered her his hand, his palm rough and scarred. "Can't promise I'm any good at it." She took his hand and let him guide her in a slow, swaying circle on the porch, beneath the first stars. There was no music but the wind and the rhythm of 2 hearts learning to beat as one. When they stopped, she rested her forehead against his chest. "I haven't danced since my mother died," she confessed. He placed a large, warm hand on the back of her head. "Then let this be a new beginning." The next morning, he found her on the porch, holding a crumpled letter. "Someone left this in town," she said. "It's from Shaw." His jaw tightened as he took it from her. He read the words aloud, "Abigail. You are mine still. Don't you forget it. The law is on my side. I will take you back when I please." Silas crushed the paper in his fist. "You don't have to be afraid of him." She looked out at the silent, watching trees. "I'm not." He looked at her then, truly looked at the woman she had become. "What are you, then?" She met his gaze, her voice clear and solid as the mountain itself. Ready. Silas was gone, having ridden out at sunrise to check his snares. He said he'd be back by dusk. She trusted him. Now, she stood in the center of the cabin, a spoon in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a familiar, mocking voice. "Abigail! You in there, girl?" It was Shaw. Through the window slats, she saw him flanked by two rough-looking men, one with a shotgun slung over his shoulder. "You think hiding up here with that brute means you ain't my daughter no more?" Shaw's voice barked. "You forget the law, woman. You belong to me." She reached for the iron poker by the hearth. One of the men laughed. "Look at her, boss, still trying to play house." She didn't run. Instead, she walked to the door and pulled it open. They blinked in the sudden light. Her hair was braided down her back, and she wore the red dress. "Well now," Shaw smirked. "Don't you look proud? Think this mountain man made you a lady again?" "I am not your property," she said calmly. He laughed. "By what right?" "By the right of no longer being your prisoner." The man with the shotgun stepped forward, but Shaw waved him back. He moved onto the porch. "You forget," he said, his voice a venomous whisper. "I can drag you back to town and have the marshal do my bidding." "You could," she replied softly. "But you'd be dragging a corpse." "You touch me again, Shaw, and I swear on my mother's grave, I will see you in yours." A new voice cut through the tense air. "Step off my porch." The three men spun around. Silas stood there, a steel bag over his shoulder, his eyes like gathering storm clouds. "Creed," Shaw spat. "I said, step off," Silas repeated, his voice low but carrying the weight of the mountain itself. Shaw faced him. "You have no claim on her." Silas dropped his bag and took a slow step forward. "She ain't a thing to be claimed." "Then why'd you take her?" Silas looked at Abigail. She gave a single, firm nod. That was all he needed. "Because she deserved to be chosen," he said. The man with the shotgun shifted uneasily. "Maybe we don't want trouble here." "Then you came to the wrong cabin for peace," Silas replied. Shaw's jaw clenched. "You'd fight me over some worn-out." Silas moved faster than she thought possible, grabbing Shaw by the collar and slamming him against a porch post. The wood groaned. "Don't," Silas growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "You ever call her that again?" He held his fist ready, then, with visible effort, unclenched it and let Shaw fall to the ground. "You walk away now," Silas said, stepping back, "and you get to keep your face." The thugs pulled Shaw to his feet. They retreated down the trail, muttering threats. Silas didn't watch them go. His eyes were on Abigail. She finally exhaled, her whole body trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked, stepping closer. "No," she said. "But I am standing." That night, the fire crackled, and Silas sat on the floor, leaning against the side of her rocking chair. She rested a hand on his shoulder. "I thought you'd be gone longer," she said. "I rode faster," he answered. A quiet moment passed. "He'll be back," she whispered. "Let him," Silas replied. Later, he placed a small, stitched leather pouch on the table beside her. It was filled with cedar shavings and dried lavender. "For what?" she asked. "For sleep," he said. "And for staying." She looked from the pouch to his face. "I didn't stay for charity. I know I stayed because I wanted to be seen." His answer was immediate. "You were seen the moment you stepped over my threshold," and she believed him. A late spring snow began to fall, soft and unexpected. Abigail stepped onto the porch, lifting her face to the flurry, and spun in a slow circle. It was a dance just for herself, a test of a joy she was beginning to believe might be hers to keep. Silas came outside and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. They stood together, watching the world turn white. "I don't want to hide anymore," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. Inside, the cabin glowed. Everything was ready. All the silences they had shared had led to this moment. "I want to ask you something," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I built this place to be alone. Every log was a wall against the world. But you turned it into a home. You filled it with breathing. He reached into his coat and pulled out a ring, not of metal, but carved from bone, smooth to a soft shine. A tiny pine bough was etched into its side. I made this a while ago, he said. Will you be my wife, Abigail? Not borrowed, not taken. Mine, if you'll have me. She stared at him, her lips parted, and then in a voice so steady it surprised her, she said, yes. Not because I need saving, but because I see you, and I think you finally see me, too. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. But peace is a fragile thing. At dawn, Hoofbeats returned. It was Shaw, but this time a deputy and a circuit judge rode with him. The law is on my side, Shaw declared, holding up a document. The deputy cleared his throat. The law says a daughter is under her father's care, but Abigail stepped onto the porch, barefoot in the snow, her red dress a defiant splash of color. I was not taken, she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. I walked away from a man who burned my belongings and called me useless for 20 years. Do I look caged to you now? She turned to the judge. If you force me back, you are signing a paper that says a woman's suffering has no value. The judge looked from Shaw's sneer to Abigail's quiet dignity, and then to Silas, who stood beside her like a mountain, silent and immovable. The law is not deaf, sir, the judge said to Shaw. I have heard her. She is not leaving. Shaw stared, his face twisting with hatred. I made you, he hissed at Abigail. No, she said softly. You buried me. This man, this life, they let me grow. As the riders vanished into the trees, the snow began to slow. Silas took her hand. That evening, they stood before the fire, hands clasped. No preacher, no paper, just two souls who had found their truth. With you, Silas said, I remember who I was before the world made me silent, Abigail replied, and with you, I learned I was never broken, only waiting for gentle hands. They kissed then, slow and reverent. Later, she sat in the rocking chair he had built, while he carved a new figurine, a woman in a red dress, her head held high. He set it beside the foxes and the bird on the window sill. Outside, the tree stood tall and certain. Inside, love had taken root, quiet, strong, and undeniable. She was not too old. She was not forgotten. She was home.